Hello and welcome to more Argument Basics. In this short video, we'll take a look at the Reductio ad absurdum, which is an absurdly powerful bit of argumentation. So, as it's usually presented, the Reductio ad absurdum is considered a form of deductive reasoning. And here's how it works. There are two forms. So, informally, here's how it goes. What you do is, kind of weirdly, is assume that a claim is true in order to prove it's false. And that may seem kind of odd, but here's how it works. So if you assume that a claim is true, and you can prove that assuming it's true leads to an absurdity, such as a logical contradiction, then that would show that the claim must actually be false. Because if assuming something is true, leads to an absurdity, impossibility, contradiction, then it can't be true. Now, of course, you can also, change the polarity, so to speak. If you want to prove that something is true, you would, again, kind of weirdly, assume that it is false and prove that it being false would lead to an absurdity or impossibility or contradiction, and then conclude that because of this, it must be true, because denying it leads to absurdity. Now, it's a very old form of argumentation. Some famous example would include use by our good dead friend Socrates in various philosophical arguments, and philosophers love to use this type of argument. Now, here's an example of the power and usefulness of a reductio ad absurdum. And this may seem kind of weird, but you can prove some pretty big things. So let's take a big example. So let's talk about the beginnings of, humans. So suppose we start off with a human, Mark 1 standard human. Now, where does the human come from? Well, laying aside, things like, cloning and so forth, we can go with the old-fashioned way of you get a human from two other humans. And so it seems reasonable to accept that for each human we have, that human has two human parents. Again, laying aside, genetic engineering, techie stuff, etc. That's how, it works. Now, this seems perfectly reasonable. And you may be wondering, how is this going to lead to something impossible or a contradiction? Well, here's how it can happen. So if every human has to have two human parents, this means that the person's parents must also have parents. Let's say they have grandparents. And then, of course, those grandparents have to have parents, and so on. And here's where the problem comes in. Because if every human has to have human parents, this would go on to infinity. Because you'd always need, for every human you've got, you would need more humans. And of course, this would require infinite humans. We don't have an infinite number of humans. We don't have we might have infinite time, but we don't have infinite humans. So this creates an absurdity, because if every human has to have human parents, weirdly enough, we can never have any humans around today, because there'd be no first human to start humanity. So how do people solve this problem in metaphysics and science, etc.? Well, grossly oversimplifying things, the two main approaches are what people will do is they would say, well, we can go with evolution. You had non-humans, and through evolution, eventually arose, humans. And you could trace this back to whatever the primordial life form is. And that gave rise to humans. Now then, of course, as the question arises again, where do you get that stuff from? So the reductio ad absurdum then leads to the question of where do you get everything from? And some people, the two, to oversimplify, the two standard answers are one, the scientific one, Big Bang or whatever, where it just happens. There's no, supernatural stuff involved. Another common one of, bazillions of other options is the creation hypothesis, where you have God create everything. Now, both of those, of course, solve the problem, because either you get, everything coming from a Big Bang, or you have God creating it. That, of course, leads to other problems. So the reductio is a powerful form of argumentation, and very useful in addressing metaphysical, religious, philosophical concerns. It's also useful in other contexts as well. So if you can show, say in a more mundane setting, that something leads to an impossibility or contradiction, then it can't be true. As a basic example, suppose you're in a philosophy class or another class and you're trying to define the term oppression. And someone says, oh, hey, oppression is the mistreatment of a numerical minority by a numerical majority. And that sounds kind of plausible. And then, of course, some philosophy major in the class says, aha, I can reduce that to absurdity. And how would they do it? Well, here's the way it would be done. If that's the definition of oppression, then it would follow that women are not oppressed by men. Like, it can't happen. Why not? Well, even though apparently more male babies are born, they sadly don't make it to like adulthood, etc. And so we end up having in the population is that we have percentage-wise a higher percentage typically of women more than men. Not a huge amount, but a like a 1% difference. Varies of course by location. And so there are more women than men. Therefore, under this view, this definition, women can never be oppressed, which is of course absurd. And looking at it, you might think, well, oppression, obviously, to reduce it to further absurdity, oppression is obviously not just a matter of like numbers, it's a matter of like behavior, etc. And so we conclude that that definition has been reduced to absurdity. And so it's a very useful method, effective in dealing with definitions, etc., which is how our good dead friend Socrates often used it. And so that's a very brief look at the Reductio ad absurdum, a favorite of philosophers and people who are really into language and definitions everywhere. So in terms of why there are fewer men than women, even though more male babies are born, anecdotally, one way you can kind of get an answer to this is see movies like Jackass 1, 2, and 3D. It can involve things like shopping carts and rockets. Poor decision making. So, Reductio ad absurdum, useful. And see you in the future with more argument basics.